Hey guys, I'm Gaspachian. You've seen me nearly hit the mun, it's only going to get worse from here. In fact, our first mission in this episode is pretty much the same as last episode's mission to the mun, but now we're targeting Minmus instead. This time, we will do no fancy sample return mission for the sake of simplicity, brevity, and the fact that our contract specifies we need to escape the gravitational pull of Kerbin entirely. Leaving out the return from our mission parameters will of course allow us to use the mass budget for chutes and heat shields to achieve other goals, such as packing more science experiments. All in all, the mission is going to be a simpler follow-up to our lunar flyby, which is great considering how much we're hoping to achieve this episode. Those who recall last episode's mission will remember that our main difficulties in pulling the stunts off were ones of maneuvering authority and staying connected to the KSP. Both of these difficulties have since been alleviated, with RCS thrusters having been researched and our first comms network firmly in place. More or less at the very least, because as you'll see later, we're entering the stage of the playthrough where it's starting to make more sense to present missions slightly out of order. This mission, for example, was launched while the comms network was still being put into place. Still, the partial network is going to give us way more uptime than we ever had for our lunar flyby and recovery. Now, getting to Minmus is, as people may be aware, made a bit trickier by its relative inclination to the ecliptic plane. In stock, what this means is that you'd want to launch when passing the ascending or descending node and minimize your relative inclination right away for efficiency. Here, however, the relative inclination poses another challenge entirely. You see, our launch site is situated 28 degrees north of Kerbin's equator, as to be aligned with the Mun and reasonably aligned with the rest of the Kerbal system. What's really being modeled is Kerbin having a similar axial tilt to the Earth, but since axial tilt isn't a property that KSP allows bodies to have, the orbital plane has to be shifted instead. It's all very technical, but something RSS players and harder solar system players alike have to get used to. The point is, we're launching from 28 degrees north, which means that the lowest resulting inclination our orbit can have after launch is 28 degrees. We can easily increase this inclination on launch by changing our launch azimuth, but decreasing it is impossible without further orbital maneuvers post-launch. Which presents a problem with Minmus in our system, which is orbiting Kerbin with an inclination of only about 23 degrees. This means we cannot get our post-launch relative inclination with Minmus below 5 degrees without further maneuvers, and with the vastly higher orbital speeds compared to stock, you'd find that plane change maneuvers are for the most part unfeasible. What we instead do is plot for a transfer burn at one of their intersecting nodes, and wait a number of orbits until the phase angles agree with the transfer. This way, we forgo the need of an expensive plane change maneuver that we in any case couldn't afford to perform even if we wanted to do it with this craft. This is a career with tight margins on funds, so packing more Delta V than we have to is completely out of the question most of the time. Anyways, the maneuver was plotted, we waited 12 days and in the meantime put up another satellite in the network, promising even better uptime in preparation for this maneuver. One thing to note though is that we will only have connection to the KSP while the Space Center is in plane with the network. I believe the uptime window is about 12 hours for every 24, again showing the problems of deploying such a near-orbiting network that we discussed in last episode. Before the burn, we dumped some monopropellant to make sure the margins were on our side in case we need to perform corrections down the line. This mission will call for way less precision than the return mission we conducted earlier, since the only target we really have to aim in for is low space around Minmus. Even so, some concern washes over mission control as the end of the burn nears and the predicted orbital path veers heavily from the plotted one. The craft is immediately turned about to correct the maneuvers, using up much of the dwindling fuel resources, until a perimin of 1,600 or so kilometers is achieved. Had we hit Minmus right at the descending node, we could at this point have gotten way closer. But due to the deviations from the maneuver, we're now coming in far above the Moon's North Pole. Luckily, with the distances involved, a maneuver can be plotted for that cheaply corrects our flyby to be much closer to the surface. Those not familiar with 64k will also be able to remark, now that we've gotten a closer look at the Moon, that Minmus is very round compared to stock. This is because how the 64k rescale works. The sizes of the planets are blown up, while the altitudes of the terrain features remain the same. We've seen this previously on Kerbal, with mountains appearing very smooth compared to stock, and our Moon flyby also showcased a very smooth landscape compared to what you'd expect. There are additional mods to correct these features in various ways, either by procedurally adding features, playing around with gradients for the height maps, or simply scaling up altitudes by the same factor as planets. The latter variant would for 64k results in mountains on Kerbal up to 40 kilometers high, which of course is not very realistic at all. Whichever method you may prefer, I've not installed any such corrections in my playthrough. Mostly because I'm dealing with enough mods and conflicts as is, rather than preferring the flat, rather boring landscapes 64k results in. Flat bodies or not, we are coming in for a flyby and prepared to collect all the science as we did by the Mun. This time foregoing an actual return of any experiments, so the values will be diminished. We make sure to load up the flight computers with instructions to run the experiments when we hit Pyramid in case our comms drop out before that. For some reason, our thermometer was less than cooperative when setting up these actions, but that's going to turn out to be of no matter. Because just as before, our precautions were in vain and we hit low space way before our comms cut out, allowing us to, if we so choose, run all the experiments manually. Again, with remote tech being the hack it is, we'd still be allowed to run them through Science Alert, but we plan for redundancy in this space program. With all near space science available to us broadcasted, there's no point in sticking around, so we begin our slow but highly accelerated drift out to Kerbal's SOI. We thereby get more science, complete the contract, and pick up some world's firsts, albeit the rewards are heavily discounted by Strategia because of our currently active Mun probe strategy. Even so, the mission is considered a success, and Minshot is already hailed as one of the most historically significant pieces of space debris out there. With the science we had left over from earlier, plus the gains we made during that mission, we're going to pick up propulsion systems and enhance survivability. We don't have a real need for either tech at the moment, but they are prerequisites for techs down the road that are essential to our continued strides into space, some of which we're convinced will be made not by probes, but by Kerbals. Yes, some 7.5 Earth years since the start of this space program, we are finally getting to the point of sending up a manned capsule to space. Which arguably is faster than the progress of spaceflight in real life, but again, we're facing smaller bodies and thus smaller challenges. Also, the main factor holding us back thus far has been scientific progress rates, and with those conflicts being home-rolled, anything goes as far as realistic progression rates go. Our first manned spaceflight will, just as in real life, be an orbital one. For this sole purpose, the crew module we're designing is going to be overkill in so many ways, but this is intentional to allow it to carry out an abundance of missions with little redesign. In this first design, it is going to act as a second stage for our orbital insertion, but we're building it with sufficient margins that it may be employed for a wide set of orbital maneuvers if launched on a bigger launcher. Many aspects of this vehicle does not mirror any real-life counterpart. For instance, no vehicle has thus far launched a manned capsule inside a fairing. The reason for this is of course the need for launch abort systems. something our first flights will not bother with. Had we played with test flight or dang it installed, our craft would look very different to what you see now. But here we instead assume our Kerbal is a very foolhardy or brave soul willing to risk everything to plunge out into the ill-known void. The lucky gal who will in one capacity or another don the pages of the history books is Auður Halldórsdóttir, a brave woman of Icelandic descent. Surely, the only thing facing her at this time as she is strapped into the seat of the Hugin 1 orbital vehicle is that her name contains diacritics, something the KSP UI font apparently cannot deal with. This, of course, will mellow her mood somewhat during the first stages of the launch, in which she goes for a very aggressive pitch-down maneuver. Hopefully, that will not be a cause for concern later. Launch-wise, this is very similar to our first unmanned orbital flights. Liquid engines versus solid boosters matter only a little at this stage, since we're going full throttle in either case. The big upshot, however, is that we will retain local control throughout, so we don't have to worry about remote tech making our craft uncontrollable. As we can see, this is well because of our low ascent. Our fairings, however, decided something has to go wrong with the flight anyways, but this turns out to have no real lasting ill effects on the launch, except costing us a solar panel. There are absolutely merits to making orbit using a shallow ascent profile if your craft has the TWR to pull it off, even if it at times may be nerve-wracking. If you manage it, you will have wasted a very minimum amount of delta V, even though you'll be spending a lot of time in the atmosphere. The upper layers of the atmosphere are in this case so rarefied that drag is pretty much just a word rather than anything measurable, especially with Ferrum Aerospace installed. We've seen earlier in the series that hanging out in the upper atmosphere has rarely been enough to alter orbits as much as we'd expect, and so it again seems to be in this case. With our orbital burn almost finished inside the atmosphere, however, we had to coast to our apoapsis before finishing off the circularization. Feast your eyes on this rare occurrence, since for much of this series almost all of our orbital insertions have been or will be uninterrupted burns. After circularizing, we're left with plenty of fuel to spare, totaling more than 400 delta V left in the stage counting the monopropellant we brought. This should mean that the launch vehicle is capable of putting this craft in a polar orbit as well, which we'll be very interested to do to fully deplete the science available to us. For now though, Auður is ordered to return to the ground after one record-breaking lap around the planet, as to not risk that lone solar panel causing a PR disaster in failing to provide life support for the duration of her stay in space. The plan for the retrograde burn is to take her close to the KSC, as little as that may matter at this point in time for our space program, and she hopes to accomplish this by getting her periaps to touch the ground 90 degrees beyond the space center. She'll be sure to get back to the planet. Getting close to the KSC is more of an experiment than anything. It is, however, the case that the retroburn led her to overshoot the KSC by about 1200 kilometers. So apart from breaking the record for being the first Kerbal in space, she'll also have to break a few records for endurance swimming. All in all, the mission is a resounding success, which leads to bigwigs in administration to consider the profits we could make for our program were we to send up paying customers rather than freeloading astronauts. But before they get their say, the scientists have scheduled another exploratory mission to further our understanding of the cosmos and bigger boosters, which are somehow intertwined. They realize that they need a few more science points to unlock the next size of engines and fuel tanks, so our next mission will be a return to the sounding rocketry of old. The difference this time is that we're now in possession of sample return technology and bigger engines, which we'll want to combine to get at the elusive science hidden in space high above Kerbin. Other probes have gone through space at that altitude before, but their science payloads were instead destined to be deployed at more interesting locations. However, as with much in this series, this attempt was more or less eyeballed and will fail to reach its intended destination. Because gravity, it seems, is a fickle mistress. To get to high altitude space in 64k, we need to hit an altitude of not 250 kilometers, as in the stock game, but rather 3,840 kilometers. To get to those altitudes, we need to be moving at more or less orbital velocities almost straight up. Did this craft have enough delta V to accomplish this? Maybe. But without a very high thrust to weight ratio, the losses to gravity means we didn't even come close. So why am I even showing you this mission if it was a failure? Because it wasn't a complete failure in getting some science at the very least. It also shows that doing things haphazardly is not really something we can afford with the scales involved, and also that we must consider each subsystem before launch. In this case, for instance, we lost connectivity with the KSP because of the infamous always on Omni antenna not being always on. So this mission will, apart from getting the science points we allegedly need, in spite of the mission parameters not being fulfilled, serve as a reminder for future exploration to measure twice, hammer once. Which again may be something we should have done ahead of time, not just when building the rocket, but when planning our research path. It turns out we need to research aerodynamics before we have a shot at unlocking the next tier of rocket sizes and engines. In my defense, it's very hard to see that the two nodes are connected, but still though. In any case, since we have to get the aerodynamics, which unlocks pretty much nothing we need right now, we spend the science there and bank our remaining science in anticipation of future missions. But now, scientific progress will have to step aside for a moment as we contemplate the future funding of our program. For this, we look to the thrill-seeking millionaires of Kerbal. Actually, we're going to be happy to let anyone with a couple dozen thousand pesos aboard our suborbital ventures, whatever that may translate to in real-world currencies. Point is, we're offered contracts to send up multiple Kerbals to suborbital flights, netting us some meager funds and a small chunk of reputation for each. It sounds just like the stock contracts, because these are stock contracts, obviously. To make this financially profitable, we've designed a launcher without the bangs and whistles of our more capable rockets. Meant to bring one crewed capsule to the brink of space for little more than spare change, maximizing our return on investment and hurrying our conquest of the void. This is of course not at all akin to history, once again showing how alternate the progression things take when you let the contract system decide your next move. In real life, the first case of space tourism, a proper orbital flight at that, took place in 2001 on board a Soyuz capsule. The gap of decades between the first manned orbital flight and the first paying onboard customer apparently didn't sit quite right in the minds of the higher-ups within the GSA. So here we're sending up multiple Kerbals on ill-studied crafts with uncertain capabilities. Again, in real life, the first suborbital manned space flights took place on the Mercury Redstone rocket, a derivative of the Redstone, which itself borrowed many design features from the German V2. In effect, the vessel design had in various iterations been studied for more than a decade and a half before strapping a live, thoroughly trained astronaut inside the Mercury capsule. Here, we're heading for space a few days after finalizing the first draft of our own design. Again, with another set of mods, this lack of planning could very well have led this thing to being a suicide mission. But we really only have to consider two variables here. Do we have enough delta V? And do we have working parachutes to get us down safely? Anyways, suborbital flights is something anyone could pull off in the first half hour of playing this game, and our set of mods don't particularly increase the difficulty of this stunt. Instead, let us admire the short-lasting beauty our customers get to experience in exchange for their hard-earned cash as they make way financially for our other, larger launches to farther destinations. but that is something we'll deal with in upcoming episodes, and I will see you guys then.